Out of Water, a Stewart Masterson story by Ruth Madison, read by the author. You just drove that dinky car of yours across the entire country? Claire huffed into the phone. Stewart, one of these days you are going to give me an ulcer. That's why I didn't tell you about it, he said, rolling down his car window and closing his eyes, smelling the salt air. He was in California again, sitting in his car in the parking lot of an apartment building. His Aunt Claire continued to tell him how stupid he had been until Stewart finally interrupted her. Claire, listen, I'm fine. I'm here. Everything is good. Can I talk to you later? Oh, we will talk later. I have more to say to you. What if you had broken down in the middle of the country? What if you couldn't get help? Giving a little bit of latitude to your weaknesses is not a bad thing. It's a safe thing. I'm fine. Everything is fine. You just think about how your choices are going to impact everyone else if you die out on the road unable to get help. Thinking about it right now. I'll get back to you. From here he could see his friend Jeff's apartment on the second floor. The window was open. He must be home. Oh, Stewart, his aunt said with a sigh, you know I only worry because I love you. I'll talk to you later, I promise. He wasn't about to confess that he had come all this way without telling anyone he was coming. Technically he had no place to stay, but he had no doubt Jeff would take him in, and Claire would be happy with that. Jeff had come to her house last Christmas, so she felt like she knew him. He hung up his phone and pushed it into the front pocket of his jeans, maneuvering against his thigh. He opened the car door, then leaned across to his passenger seat and grabbed the frame of his wheelchair, putting it on the pavement. Upended on the ground, the little caster wheels spun. He held it steady with one hand and attached the larger wheels one at a time with the other, then flipped it right side up. He passed the black seat cushion over last, and the strips of Velcro adhered. Getting a grip on the seat cushion, he shifted his butt onto the chair, then lifted his legs over one at a time and tucked his feet onto the plate. The whole maneuver took less than a minute. He slid his hands across the rails of his wheels, closed the car door and locked it. He rested his hand on the door of the car for a moment, smiling at its faded blue. Good girl, he said softly. No one was in sight. It was a classic Los Angeles day with a comfortable heat and hardly a cloud in the sky. He pushed inside the building, the ground suddenly changing to low carpeting that required just a bit more force. He entered the elevator and pressed the button for the second floor. During the brief ride up, he moved his cell phone from where it was threatening to burst back out of his pocket and stashed it in the pouch behind his legs. He rolled slowly down the hallway and stopped at Jeff's door. He paused for a moment before giving a sharp knock. Jeff swung open the door, and the look of surprise on his face was quickly replaced with a grin. Well, 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 look who's back, he remarked, leaning his lanky body against the door frame. Just couldn't stay away, could you? That was the truth. Good to see you too, Stewart said. Jeff moved back, and Stewart rolled into the small apartment that he remembered so well. Do you want a beer? Jeff said. Absolutely, Stewart said. He parked himself beside the sofa in the living room, where he could see out the window to the balcony. The same balcony he had once jumped over, landing in soft dirt, catapulting himself down the same street, feet pounding the ground as wind howled in his ears, one singular thought blocking all others, get to Pete before it was too late. And funny enough, that was the last time his feet had ever pounded ground. Jeff walked in and handed him a beer can, then slumped onto the sofa. Not that I'm complaining, Jeff said, but I didn't see you for 7 years, and now this is the 3rd time this year. Technically, one of those was December of last year. You're going to be a teacher. You need to get used to school years. Speaking of, didn't you have to get back to Massachusetts for that? Stewart was in his last year of getting a teaching degree to become a high school science teacher. He looked away from the window and back to his friend. I transferred, he said. I was wondering if I could stay with you until I get set up here. Jeff sat up straight suddenly. Are you saying you're moving back? That's what I'm saying. Jeff clapped his hands and said, This is going to be awesome. Over the summer, Stewart had reluctantly agreed to come back to California at Jeff's insistence. His friend had wanted him to give a speech at the annual surfing competition. There was a time when Stewart dominated that competition. He had been surprised how nice it was to be back in the ocean, surfing again. Even though he knew adaptive sports were a thing, he hadn't surfed since his injury. Nothing had ever felt more like coming home. When it came time to travel back to Massachusetts, he found himself reluctant to go. Stewart hadn't expected to feel torn as he left. The ocean was pulling him, drawing him to stay. California was his home. It was where he had been born, and once the ocean claimed you, it never really let go. Despite all the running he had done, What he had left behind would not stay quiet in his mind. "You going to see your dad now that you'll be here longer than a few days?" Jeff asked. "Wasn't planning to," Stewart answered. Jeff didn't pursue the subject. "You're totally welcome to stay here as long as you need." "Great, my bag is in the car." "Why don't we get it on the way back after the bar? I need to get down there. The kid I hired part-time gets off in about 20 minutes. "Sounds good." "Cool. I'm going to call Lee and Leah and see if they want to meet up with us. It'll be just like old times." Stewart chuckled to himself. Jeff's optimism was unbeatable. It was unlikely to be just like old times. The summer he was 16, Stewart was the local surfing champion, Leah was his girlfriend, and her twin brother Lee was always in his shadow. Things were a little different these days. Outside, they started down the sidewalk towards the sunset. "Are you okay to, walk?" Jeff said. Stewart looked up at his friend's concerned face and couldn't help the edge of his mouth twitching toward a smile. "I know where the damn bar is, Jeff. How many times have I crashed at your place?" "Okay, yeah, but that was 7 years ago. Things are different," Jeff said. "Right," Stewart said, beginning to push down the street towards the bar. "I wasn't paralyzed." "Now that you mention it," Jeff said, "I thought something was different." Stewart laughed. "I'm not offended by the word walk, okay, so don't worry about it." Sand was brushed up over the sidewalk, and it caught in Stewart's wheels, showering down over his hands. The warm air picked up salt from the ocean as it whipped down the beach. Jeff's small wooden shack rested right at the edge. People crowded around the doorway, smoking, leaning against motorcycles, or strolling slowly down the boardwalk nearby. As they got closer, Stewart noticed the wooden ramp on the side of the stairs. "This is new," he said, pushing himself up it. "Someone told me I get a tax break," Jeff said. "I'm sure that's the reason." Stewart paused in the doorway to take in the scene. He had missed this place. Not much had changed in the years he'd been gone. There were a few tables, a long wooden bar, a small dance floor, everything in dark wood. This was where all the locals came. Jeff lived for this place, building it into the perfect hangout. Leah was already there. She was leaning over the bar, wearing a miniskirt that didn't quite cover her butt and a sports bra. Her warm honey skin glistened, still wet from swimming. The few patrons inside were all riveted to her. As Stewart's wheels rumbled onto the wooden floor, she turned and fixed him with her well-honed siren smile. Jeff gave her a wave, then went into the kitchen to get them food. Stewart slowly wheeled forward, and Leah joined him at a table. He pulled a chair out of the way and slid into its place. Leah leaned back, and her eyes slowly looked him up and down. "Is your foot supposed to do that?" "Huh?" Stewart looked down to see his foot shaking. "Oh, yeah," he said. "Don't worry about that." He grabbed his knee and pulled the leg further in. "It'll stop in a minute." "That's some weird shit," Leah said, throwing back her drink. "I guess. Does it bother you?" "It's different. You're not the way I remember you." "You've changed too," Stewart said with a smile. "Have not?" Leah laughed, smacking his shoulder. "Hey, I didn't hurt you, did I?" "Are you kidding? These shoulders are as solid as granite," Stewart said, flexing his arm until the sleeve of his t-shirt was cutting into his skin. Leah touched his neck and slid her hand down to his shoulders. "Oh my God, they are like one enormous brick wall." Her hand slid further down his back to the top of the wheelchair. Hey, Stewart said. "Let's keep those hands where I can feel them." She moved them back to the table. "Your foot stopped." Stewart looked down. "Oh, yeah." "What does it mean that your foot does that? Like, does that mean you could get better?" "No," he chuckled. "Severed spinal cords are pretty final, as it turns out." "Sorry, I shouldn't have said." "You can ask me whatever you want, Leah. We're friends. Really, whatever you want to know, just ask." Leah smiled and put her bare foot against his crotch. "Does it still work?" "Whoa," Stewart said, rolling back. Her foot fell to the floor in front of her, an anklet jingling. She grinned at him. "I really don't want to do this with you." "Do what?" She leaned forward and smiled again, twirling a piece of her ocean-soaked hair in front of her, acting like she didn't know he was aware of the games she liked to play. Jeff came over with baskets of burgers and drinks and put them down. "So," Jeff said, "I was thinking that tomorrow we should catch the surf together, like old times." "I can't," Stewart said. "I'm starting student teaching in the morning." "Oh, right," Jeff said. "Saturday, though," Stewart said. "We can go Saturday morning." Leah hadn't taken her eyes off Stewart, and he was purposely not looking back at her. She wasn't really interested in him. This was all a game she was good at, and always had been. All she wanted to do was win, not actually follow through on any flirting. But Stewart liked to win, too. He decided to make her as uncomfortable as he possibly could. He pushed his hands against the seat of his wheelchair, shifting his body, and thought, "Score one for me," when Leah looked away and fidgeted with her hair. "If we get out early enough to beat the tourists," Jeff said. "Yeah, maybe," Stewart said, looking at Leah. "But, it takes me a while to get ready in the morning these days." She met his eye, and he couldn't read her expression. She certainly didn't look disgusted or put off. "What about Lee?" Stewart said. "It's not the old gang without your brother." "He probably won't make it," Leah said. "He hasn't been able to look at me since my injury," Stewart said, slapping his lap for emphasis. "Oh, so he's an ass," Leah said. "What else is new?" Stewart started laughing. He couldn't keep up the pretense. "Tell him I want to talk to him." "He's scared to death of you." "I know, and it's ridiculous." Jeff went back to the bar to serve more customers. "Are you staying at a hotel?" Leah asked. Stewart shook his head. "I'll crash on Jeff's couch until I find a place." "Isn't a hotel easier for you? With, the wheelchair and all?" "Nah, Jeff's is fine. I don't really need anything special." While they ate, Leah's eyes wandered around the place. Stewart guessed she was looking for a new victim to charm. "I'm going to head back to Jeff's. I have to get up early tomorrow for teaching." "You're getting old," Leah smiled. "And yet, somehow I stay the same." "Ha ha," Stewart said flatly. He rolled over to the bar and got Jeff's keys. Even though Stewart told Jeff he had no intention of visiting his father, after school each weekday he found himself in the neighborhood. He took to parking across the street and just looking at the house. He hadn't been inside since his father had sent him to the East Coast to live with his aunt. Considering how badly his father wanted to erase the past, Stewart was surprised he still lived in the house where Stewart's mother had died. But he knew they were there. He saw the family coming and going, a perfect little unit without him. From afar he observed his two little half-sisters, who had grown so tall and beautiful that he would not have recognized them if he hadn't seen them with his father. Stewart didn't know why he kept watching them. He didn't know what he expected to do, but he didn't plan to ever talk to them. When he got back to Jeff's late each afternoon, his friend never asked where he had been. One day Stewart watched as Ellen returned to the house alone. She had probably dropped the girls off for some activity or other. She parked her car and got out. Ellen was utterly different from how he remembered her. She was smaller and more meek. Without his cloud of anger, he could see the twitchy worry on her face, the way she never looked sure of herself. How could he have screamed at this poor woman? Regret circled his chest. The only thing he had noticed about her back then was that she was not his mother. Then Stewart realized she was looking back at him. She frowned and began to walk towards his car. Stewart fumbled with his key, hurrying to get away before she realized who he was. She was beside the car before he could pull away, though. She stood just to the side of the driver's door and frowned, looking in at him. He could practically see the gears turning in her head as she tried to work out why he looked familiar. Then her hand flew in front of her mouth, and her eyes filled with tears. He rolled down the window. "Stewart?" she whispered. "Hey, Ellen," he said. There was fear in the creases around her eyes. She was thinking about the same moment he was sure of it. In the stairwell of the house behind her, late at night, the only light from the open door of a bathroom on the second floor, her thin body pressed against the wall, and his hands holding her there. "It's been so long," she said. She seemed to be having trouble figuring out what else to say. Though Stewart had seen his father most Christmases, he hadn't seen Ellen in 12 years. After that night when Ellen had confronted him for coming home wasted, and he had left marks on her skin from shoving her against the wall, his father had shipped him off to South Carolina to live with Aunt Claire. He hadn't seen his stepmother since. "You should come in," she continued. "I can't," Stewart said, glancing behind her to the series of steps up to the front door of the house. "You can. Really, Stewart. The past is the past. I've so wanted the chance to talk to you again." "No, I really can't." I haven't seen you in years, and here you are. Don't you want to talk?" I can't come in because of the stairs. She tilted her head and frowned. He realized that she couldn't see the logo on his license plate, and her gaze hadn't shifted from him long enough to take in the jumble of wheels and tubes on the seat beside him. She had no idea that he was paralyzed. "Wait a minute," he said. "My dad never told you?" "Told me what?" "Well, isn't that just like him?" "I don't understand." Ellen moved back as Stewart fully opened the car door and shoved his thin legs out onto the ground. The surprise movement caused one of them to start twitching. His sneakers landed on their sides, not flat on the ground as they would be if you were going to stand. "I can't walk," he said. Ellen opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked for a long time just at his legs. He stayed quiet and let her look. Slowly, Ellen's eyes rose back to his face, and Stewart could read every emotion behind her eyes. Shock, relief, then pity. Her tense body relaxed at last. "How long?" she said. 7 years, Stewart said. "Richard never said." She was so easy to read. He saw her trying to reconcile that her husband had never mentioned her stepson almost dying and being paralyzed. "He wishes I didn't exist," Stewart said. "It's okay." "I never wanted that, Stewart. I hope you know that. I wanted us to be a family." "It's not your fault. It's something between me and Dad." "Can I tell him you were here?" "If you must," Stewart said. "I wouldn't recommend it, though." "Are you living in the area now?" "Yeah, I just moved back." "I'd like to be able to reach you. Maybe we could start fresh." Stewart nodded. "That's fair. Let me give you my phone number." Ellen took it, then reached forward and gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Good to see you," she said. He watched as she walked to the house, then he pulled his legs back in and drove to Jeff's. The apartment was empty when he got back, so he did some schoolwork and ate chips from the cabinet. When it started getting late, he took off towards the bar. As he got close, he saw Leah sitting on a curb outside. Her eyes were gazing in an unfocused way at the pavement in front of her. No one else was around. Stewart changed course and headed for her. He pulled up in front of her. Leah looked at his feet, and slowly, unsteadily, her gaze rose up the rest of his body to his face. It wasn't even 10 o'clock yet. "Hey, Stewart," she smiled. "How drunk are you?" he said. She flicked her hand dismissively. He leaned forward and gripped her elbow while holding onto his wheelchair with his other hand to keep his balance. "Let me get you home," he said. She stood, then leaned over him, her long dark hair brushing against the sides of his face. "I knew you couldn't resist me," she whispered, and her breath was warm against his forehead, smelling of beer and raspberries. He closed his eyes and clutched the seat of his chair for a moment to get control over himself. "It isn't real," he reminded himself. "Where do you live?" he said. "This way." She started to walk forward, but she was unstable, and her long legs seemed to be everywhere at once. Stewart was afraid he was going to run over her feet. His phone began to ring. He frowned and grabbed it out of the pouch behind his legs. Pete's mother's name appeared on the screen. Stewart felt the guilt tightening in his chest. "Hang on," he said to Leah. "I need to take this." Leah nodded and promptly sat down on Stewart's lap. He tried to disentangle himself from her limbs as he answered, but she wrapped her lanky arms around his neck and rested her head on his shoulder. "Ms. Morris," he said into the phone, "how are you?" "I hate this time of year," she said. "I do too," he said. It was the gray period, in between when Pete died in the summer and his birthday near Christmas. "Do you ever feel like you're in the wrong life, and your real life is waiting for you to get back to it?" "Yes," Stewart said. He knew exactly what she meant. Each morning while he did his stretches, he had a moment while touching the legs that he couldn't feel, where he disbelieved that this was his body. Leah began to kiss his neck, and he swatted at her with one hand. "The house is so empty," Miss Morris said. "Have you thought about moving to another place?" "I don't think I can." "That's okay." "I want to visit you." "I'd like that," Stewart said. He said goodbye and hung up the phone. "Who was that?" Leah said. It was Pete's mother. Stewart pushed forward, and Leah gripped him tighter to keep from falling off his lap. She frowned. Why is she calling you? That was 7 freaking years ago, and you did what you could. I mean, look at you. Stewart's jaw tightened, as it did every time someone told him that he had done his best to save Pete. He swallowed hard and tried to keep his voice light. She needs someone to listen to her. Whatever, Leah said. You're too good for this world. She returned to nibbling at his neck. The warmth of her breath sent shivers through his torso. Are there stairs at your place? Stewart said, both to change the topic and because he wanted to know if he'd be able to see her in. She grinned at him. Leah, focus. Are there stairs at your place? I'm on the first floor, she said in a low voice, running her fingers through his hair and giving a mild tug. Pay attention so you can direct me, he said. Turn right up there. She pointed toward several palm trees, outlined against an inky blue sky. When they got to her door, Leah tried to fit her key in the lock, but kept missing. Stewart reached around her and touched her hand. The skin was as smooth as he remembered, buffed by the sand. He closed his hand over hers and directed the key into the lock. The apartment was a single room, strewn with clothes. Stewart forced his wheels over the obstacles on the floor with some annoyance. He didn't care at this point if he left tire tracks on her clothes. He hoisted her off his lap, and she landed on the mattress on the floor. She giggled, rolling onto her back and fixing him with her sparkling dark eyes. I like rough, Stewart, she purred. He rolled his eyes, but hers had already closed. As her face relaxed into sleep, he saw the softness again. The years fell away, and he could see the vulnerable child he had once known. She had been hardened for a long time, but there was something underneath. She started to lightly snore, and Stewart realized he had a problem. He couldn't leave her passed out drunk on her back, but it was not going to be simple for him to roll her onto her stomach while she was on a mattress on the floor. So much of life in a wheelchair was solving puzzles and creative problem-solving. He pondered. Would he have better leverage from his chair or if he got down onto the floor? He decided to start with trying option 1. He set the brakes on his wheels, tilted his body, and grabbed onto the low back of his wheelchair with his left hand, and then leaned towards Leah with his right hand. He couldn't quite reach her arm, but his fingertips made contact, so he tried to flick his fingers to get a grip onto her. He was so focused on how close he was to getting hold of her arm that he didn't notice his center of gravity tipping too far forward until the entire wheelchair fell forward, dumping him onto the mattress. Fuck. Well, option 2 it was. He shoved the wheelchair off his back to deal with later. Leverage was still the key. He tested how far the wall was, and found he could lean his right palm against it and get his left underneath her. He said a silent prayer of thanks that his level of injury was low enough that he still had full strength in his arms as he hoisted her onto her stomach. He was breathing hard now, so he waited a few minutes before tackling the next challenge. His wheelchair was on its side on the floor just a few feet away. Stewart used his hands to slowly shift his body over to it. He yanked it right side up, pressed one palm against the seat, tested its stability, then launched his body up onto it. His arms were going to be burning by morning, that was for sure. One more glance at Leah, and she was sleeping peacefully. Stewart left, making sure the door was locked behind him. Stewart woke to the sound of his cell phone ringing. Bleary-eyed, he felt around beside the couch until he found his empty wheelchair and grabbed the phone out of the pouch. "Hello?" he mumbled. "Stewart, this is Ellen," his stepmother said. Her voice sounded tight. "What's wrong?" he asked. "It's your father. He's had a stroke." "Oh my God." "And I just don't know what to do. He's going to be okay, they say, but it'll be a long recovery. They'll send him home in a few days, and I can't deal with him by myself." "I'm sorry," Stewart said. "You've got to come stay with us. He doesn't listen to me, but I know you can get through to him." "I can't even get into the house. How am I going to help you?" "I'll have a ramp put in. Please, Stewart. He needs you." Stewart pinched the bridge of his nose. "He's going to be furious when he finds out you invited me." "Does that mean you'll come?" Stewart sighed. "Yeah, it does." Stewart hung up and put the phone back, then rubbed his eyes and groaned. It was too late to go back to sleep. He had to get up for teaching. In the afternoon, Stewart began to gather his things back into his duffel bag. He'd just gotten his toothbrush from the bathroom when Leah burst through the door. "Beat it, Jeff," she said. "Hey," Jeff responded from the kitchenette. "This is my apartment." Leah turned and fixed him with a stare, raising one eyebrow until he slunk into his bedroom. "What happened to you last night?" Leah demanded, turning on Stewart. One hand was on her hip. "You passed out," Stewart said. "I went home." "I don't get you, Stewart." She walked over to the couch where he had been spending his nights and sat down with her legs wide. "What's not to get?" "Stop packing for a minute and talk to me. You weren't even going to tell me you were moving again?" "I'm just going to my dad's." He put his duffel bag on the floor and stopped moving, facing her. "Why do you keep putting me off?" "Come on, Leah. I know you don't really want washed-up old me." "Seriously?" "Be honest with me and be honest with yourself." "You act like you're totally comfortable and secure with your disability, but maybe you're the one who needs to be honest with themselves. I swear to God, when I look at you, I just see Stewart, the same Stewart I loved as a kid. The changes are just details." "I wish I could believe that, but I know the kind of men you date, and it's not me." "Sure," Leah said, snorting. "You know everything. Clearly, my pattern is jerks." And she left the apartment, pulling the door shut behind her with as much force as her lean, muscular arms could manage. The entire apartment seemed to shake. The bedroom door opened slowly, and Jeff gingerly walked back in. "What the hell did you say to her?" Stewart glared at him. "I don't want to talk about it." He continued to pack his things into his duffel bag. "You're about to explode," Jeff said. "I'm fine." "Look, I understand. It's more than you expected. After hiding away from all of us lunatics, it's got to be difficult to come back and deal with us again." "You're cool," Stewart said, a smile creeping onto his face. "I got no problem with you. The others I can handle. I have it under control." "You sure about that?" "Yeah," Stewart said, not at all convinced himself. He threw his bag into the back of his car and pulled his body into the driver's seat. While he disassembled his chair and put it on the seat beside him, he wondered what he would find at his father's house. He had to admit he was curious to see the inside of the house again, to see how it had changed and whether it still felt the same or not. He called Ellen and let her know he was on his way. She had done as she said, and there was an aluminum ramp over the stairs. It was steep, and it creaked and shook as Stewart wheeled up, but it worked. The door swung open when he knocked, and his two sisters were standing in front of him. They just stared at first. "Hey," he said. "Remember me?" They were eerily similar. Both tall and thin, with long blonde hair, both wearing tight jeans and layers of different colored t-shirts. Both nodded at him. One was slightly taller than the other. Stewart tried addressing her. "You're Samantha, right?" he said. "Yes," the shorter one said, "and I'm Sylvia." "You were this tall when I left," Stewart said, holding his hand out flat at the same level as the top of his wheel. "Mom said you were coming back," Samantha said, her voice much softer than her younger sister. "And you didn't believe her, did you?" Stewart said. "I did at first," Sylvia said, "but you didn't, and you didn't, and you didn't." Stewart nodded. "I'm sorry about that," he said. They were all quiet for a moment. Then Stewart said, "So, has Dad been behaving himself?" The girls giggled. "I'll take that as a no. Lead the way." They stepped back, and Stewart pulled up on his back wheels to get over the edge of the doorway. He followed the two girls down the hall. He wheeled slowly while he looked around. A lot was different. New paint color on the wall, new pictures hanging, new types of decorations. He wouldn't have known it was the same house. "He's in there," Sylvia whispered, indicating the back den. The girls backed away. They didn't seem to want to go anywhere near their father. Stewart rolled to the doorway and gently nudged the door open with his knees. Inside the room was dim. A single tall lamp in the corner cast an orange glow across a circle of the floor. The room was set up as a study, but there was now a twin bed with white sheets blocking the rust-colored couch. It didn't look like it belonged. Beside the bed was a large, boxy wheelchair with stickers on it indicating the hospital it came from. His father was lying on his side on the bed. Richard's face hadn't been shaved in several days, and his clothes were stained. He looked like a vagrant Ellen had found on the side of the road more than he looked like Stewart's father. The face of the man didn't move much, but his eyes were staring at Stewart with rage and hatred. To the side, Ellen was kneeling on the ground and trying to change Richard's socks. She stopped as Stewart came in, and the look on her face was gratitude and relief. "What are you doing here?" Richard said. and Stewart was startled by the way the words ran together, even though he knew that his father's speech could easily have been affected by the stroke. "I'm an expert on can't move," Stewart said. He rolled further into the room. Richard grunted and moved his eyes down to the carpet. Ellen stood and lightly ran over to Stewart. "Thank you so much for coming," she said. "Can I talk to you in the hall?" Stewart nodded and backed up out of the room. Ellen closed the door gently behind her. "He needs help with everything, and he yells about it," she whispered. "I'm so frazzled." "It's okay," Stewart said. "I can handle him." He knew that Ellen wasn't used to seeing the angry side of Richard. He reserved that for people he didn't respect. "So what's his situation?" Stewart asked. "He's needing to relearn a lot of motion. He's weak on his left side. We have a physical therapist coming to the house each day, but a lot of the time it's just me, and I have to go to work. Will you be able to stay with him?" Stewart nodded. "Student teaching ends next week, then I'll be free." "We'll pay for your food and all that, of course." "Don't worry about it. Go on now," Stewart said, nodding to the rest of the house. "Let me take care of him." Ellen smiled and leaned down to take his hands from his lap and squeeze them. "Bless you," she said. Stewart went into the room again, this time alone. Richard's eyes were closed, and he didn't respond when Stewart came back in. Stewart assessed the room and decided he needed to get the rug out of the way. It was a thick, patterned rug, and Stewart could tell just by looking at it that he wouldn't be able to wheel over it. While his father lay quietly, Stewart leaned over and rolled the rug, pushing it with his feet until it was against the far wall. "What are you doing here?" Richard groaned from the bed. Stewart looked at him. "Helping," he said. "I don't need you." "Sure," Stewart said. "Why don't we get you up so I can change those sheets?" Richard snorted and didn't move. Stewart grabbed hold of the ugly, shiny wheelchair that was so different from his own. He pulled it to the side of the bed and set the brake. Then he pulled himself as close to the bed as he could get and set his own brake. Stewart leaned over, one hand on the edge of his chair to keep his balance, the other getting under his father's good arm. "Okay, here we go." Thank goodness for the core muscles he still had. "Are you going to help or what?" "What's the point?" Richard said. Stewart ignored him and dragged his father into the chair without help. He gave it a solid push to get it out of the way and went to find the sheets. Richard slumped and watched as Stewart fixed up the bed. "Do you need to use the bathroom?" Stewart asked. Richard glared at him. "Right," Stewart muttered. He turned his father towards the bathroom, then got behind him and nestled his knees against the canvas back of the other chair. His arms burned with the effort of pushing both of them, but it worked. In the bathroom, there was a seat over the toilet, and Stewart helped his father onto it. Then he backed out of the room to give him privacy. When Stewart came back in, Richard said, "Is this what you do, with this stupid thing?" He rolled his head at the raised toilet seat with handles. "No," Stewart said while getting Richard back in the other wheelchair. Richard made a skeptical sound. Stewart said, "You don't need to worry about how I use the bathroom, okay?" Before getting his father back into bed, Stewart finished changing the socks that Ellen had been trying to do. He bent down, and when he was finished, he pushed his body back up by gripping his own knees and pushing up with his arms. He got Richard back into bed and covered him with a blanket, then left him alone. Stewart finished his student teaching, and then he stayed at the house, prodding Richard and taking care of him while being treated with sullen silence or insults. He wondered how long he would keep doing this. His father was definitely making improvement, and the physical therapist frequently reassured Ellen that a full recovery was likely. Stewart suspected that Ellen was hoping the situation might connect him to his father again. Stewart doubted that was going to happen. Richard still hated him, and it wasn't as though helping him to get dressed or use the bathroom was making them bond as father and son. One day, while Stewart was doing some exercises on Richard that the physical therapist had shown them, his cell phone rang. Stewart put down his father's leg and said, "I'll be right back." He backed to the edge of the room and looked at the phone. It was his aunt's number. "Claire?" he said. "Actually, it's John," his uncle said. "Is everything okay?" Stewart glanced back at Richard, who was trying to turn over and kicking all the sheets off the bed in the process. "Not exactly," John said. Suddenly he had all of Stewart's attention, and nothing in the room registered anymore. "Oh my God, are Claire and the kids?" They're fine. There was a pause, and for one crazy moment Stewart really wondered if Uncle John would ask if he was sitting down. Then John said, "It's Miss Morris." Stewart's chest tightened. "What's happened?" he said. "I'm sorry, Stewart, but she's taken her life." Stewart lost his grip on the phone, and it clattered to the ground, but he didn't notice. All the years since Pete died, Stewart had kept in touch with her, tried to keep her going. It was the only way he could see to redeem himself for his role on that stormy July day. "Stewart," John said, his voice coming from far away with the phone still on the floor. "Are you okay?" Stewart took a deep breath and tried to steady his nerves. Then he braced himself and leaned down over his legs to scoop the phone back up. "Yeah," he said. Listen, I'm not going to be able to go to the funeral. They need me here." "I don't need a babysitter," his father piped up from the other side of the room. "Shut up," Stewart said in Richard's direction. "It's okay," John said over the phone. "Everyone knows how much you helped her over these last few years." "Thanks for telling me." Stewart hung up and sat still for several minutes, the phone still in his hand. "My sister okay?" Richard said, and Stewart's attention snapped back. "Yes." Stewart turned and wheeled back to the bed. "It's Miss Morris. She's passed away." Richard snorted. "Is that all? That crazy biddy finally offed herself. About time she put herself out of her misery." Stewart's anger coursed through him so quickly that before he realized what he was doing, he had grabbed hold of his father's arm and was squeezing tight, pushing him into the bed. Richard smiled in triumph. "You see," he said, "I know the real you, and you're no different. You're as violent as ever. Nothing has changed." Stewart let go and stared into his father's face. Was it true? Had he not changed from the angry little boy he had been? He swallowed hard. His phone resting on his lap beeped, and Stewart looked down at a text message from Jeff. "Come by the bar tonight?" Stewart picked it up and texted back, "Absolutely, on my way." "I'm going to go," he whispered. He pivoted and pushed out of the room with Richard laughing behind him. "That's right," Richard said. "Run away. Just like always." When he got to the bar, it was busy. Jeff was running back and forth from the kitchen and barely had time to even nod. As Stewart looked around the room, his gaze stopped when he saw Lee, who had not yet noticed him in the crowd. Suddenly, this was looking like a setup. Jeff must have seen Lee there and told Stewart to come without mentioning it to Lee. And Jeff was right. Stewart did want to talk to Lee. He edged his way through the people, muttering "excuse me" every few moments and trying not to run over toes. When Lee looked over and caught sight of Stewart, his eyes grew large, and he glanced around as though looking for a door to escape through. Stewart rolled directly in front of him and said, "What is your problem?" Lee looked down, watching his shoe as it scuffed a mark on the floor. "I don't have a problem," he said. "Look at me," Stewart said. He waited until Lee finally raised his eyes from the ground. "We need to talk. Let's go outside where we can get some privacy." The look in Lee's eyes was fear. Stewart wondered what his old friend thought he could do to him. Behind the bar, on a strip of boardwalk between it and the beach, next to a dumpster, they found a private space. "You froze," Stewart said. "You didn't do anything." Lee swallowed, then nodded. "How did you know?" "Jeff told me." Lee looked away, crossed his arms. "Look," Stewart said, "it's okay. None of us knew what to do." He paused, then took a guess at what was bothering Lee. "I'm not upset that you have your career." They both knew the only reason Lee was on top now was that Stewart was out of his way. "Yeah, right," Lee muttered. Stewart shook his head. "I'm serious. I think things happened how they happened, and there's no point trying to figure out what we could have done differently. I've made peace with it, and I hope you will too." Lee nodded, but didn't look convinced. "You're suffering too," Stewart said. "I know you are. It's got to be hard that no one can see your wounds while mine are obvious." Lee let out a long breath. "I can't stop thinking about it," he said. "Over and over in my mind. I see you running. I feel myself frozen, over and over and over." Stewart nodded. "Me too," he said. "I have nightmares." "Same. In my dreams, I keep trying to undo it, to change the outcome. It never works. I don't know how to live with it. I mean, shit, dude, look at yourself." "I'm fine, Lee, trust me. So I'm disabled now. It's just life. Don't feel guilt on my behalf. You've got enough to carry without that." Lee pulled his fingers through his hair. "How did Jeff manage to get his wits together and call 911? Stewart shrugged. "Luck?" I wouldn't hate myself so much if I had done at least that, Lee said quietly. Maybe that's how Jeff lives with it. Stewart shrugged. Jeff has always had an impressive ability to stay focused on the present. You and I aren't like that. How do you not hate me? Lee burst out. We were both there, but I still have my career, my body intact, and you lost everything. Look at me. Look me in the eye. I don't hate you. I made my own choices, and I'm at peace with the outcome. None of it was remotely your fault. You know, they say that in the moment you find out who you really are. You can't know ahead of time how you'll react to a disaster. But now I know. Now I know that I'm not the hero. I'm not the guy who runs into danger to save people. You are. I'm the guy who freezes. Hey now, you know better than anyone that I had a more personal stake in what was happening than you did. That doesn't say anything about your character, or mine for that matter. I know everyone wants to make it into a story about Stewart the hero, but you and I know that's not the truth, right? Lee said nothing. Please tell me you haven't bought into that shit. It gets clicks, it isn't the truth. Lee was still quiet, and Stewart continued. That day broke all of us. He didn't even know how true it was until he spoke it out loud. Except maybe Jeff, Lee said, a wry smile creeping onto his face. Except maybe Jeff, Stewart agreed. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Stewart returned to his father's house. The door creaked open, and he rolled into the dark hallway. He thought about packing his bag and leaving right now. Richard wasn't interested in mending anything between them, and it wasn't Stewart's job to change that. Things could go back to the way they had been. Some part of him already knew he wasn't going to give up. He would see this project through, make sure his father was healed, and then he would find his own place and see his sisters there once in a while. That would be it. The pull-out bed in the living room was made up with fresh sheets, and Stewart hurried through his evening routine so he could collapse into oblivion and bad dreams. In the morning, Stewart continued just like before, as though Richard had never upset him. Came slinking back, did you? Richard said when Stewart brought in his breakfast. Just eat, Stewart said. Richard was able to feed himself now, a noticeable improvement from when Stewart first arrived. When Richard had finished, Stewart moved into place to help him get into the other wheelchair and into the bathroom. With his arm over Stewart's shoulder, Richard muttered, Life like this isn't worth it. Stewart rolled his eyes. Are you trying to insult me? I've been living for almost a decade with less function than you have now. Grow up. That's rich. Can we just get through this? Talking isn't necessary. You don't know, Richard said, his hot breath hitting Stewart's face. You don't know anything. Fine. I didn't deserve this, Richard muttered. Stewart stopped in the doorway to the bathroom and looked at his father. And I did? He said. Richard didn't answer, but the look on his face said that's exactly what he thought. Stewart shook his head slowly in disbelief. You really think that I deserved to get paralyzed? Richard looked at him, eyes burning with anger. You were such a brat, stubborn, difficult, diffident. I lost my mother, Stewart said, and I lost my wife. You didn't care how I felt. I was 6. And later, you weren't a kid when you hit Ellen. No, I wasn't. There's no excuse for that. Richard grunted what seemed to be some kind of approval. Did he really expect Stewart to try to defend what he had done? Once he got his father back into bed, Stewart felt his own exhaustion. Jeff was right. He was close to bursting. Definitely time for him to visit his favorite place and try to relax. He slipped by the kitchen, where Ellen and the girls were eating without them seeing him, and got out the front door. There was one spot that he always went to relax and reflect. No one else came to this corner far from the tourist attractions. He sat at the edge of the boardwalk and watched small waves getting tangled in rocks. Between the rocks and him there was sand that was almost as white as snow. The air was thick with salt, and all was silent except for the rushing sound of the water itself. The rhythm of the waves evened out his heartbeat. He breathed slowly in and out, letting the tight wrench around his heart begin to loosen. Everything would be okay. Maybe not ideal, maybe not perfect, but okay. He could be there for his friends and family. He had grown up enough to know that running away wasn't a solution to stress. Behind him he heard light footsteps against the wooden boardwalk. When he turned his head, Leah was walking towards him, barefoot, with flip-flops dangling from one hand. Stewart said, "How do you people get by without me?" Leah sat down beside him, her butt on the sandy wood of the boardwalk. He could only see the top of her head. "We manage," she said. "You don't have to take it all on by yourself, you know." They sat side by side in silence for a few minutes. Then Stewart said, "Pete's mother is gone. She took her own life." "I'm sorry," Leah said. They both continued to look down towards the water. "Why does it bother you so much?" Stewart crossed his arms. "I wanted to help," he said. He closed his eyes, ready to confess and get the guilt a little bit off his chest, even if it changed how she saw him forever. "The truth is, it was my fault." Leah looked up at him, frowning. "What are you talking about? He was out there by himself, and you ran into a storm to save him." "Everyone loves Stewart the hero. Stewart who sacrificed himself. Stewart who didn't question what it would cost him when he ran into a hurricane." "Yeah, so what?" "What they don't know is that I goaded Pete into doing it. He wouldn't have been out there if he wasn't trying to impress me." In his mind he saw the scene again, coming back from the beach before the hurricane hit, joking with Jeff and Lee, seeing that someone was still out there, and then Lee noticing that Stewart's surfboard wasn't with the others on the balcony. The horrible realization spreading through him, and then running without thinking, desperate to undo what he had done. But there was never really a chance he could have succeeded. "Wow," Leah said. "Exactly. I thought if I could help his mother, I could fix what I'd done. I never had the heart to tell her what really happened, and I hated how much she loved me for trying to save her son." Leah scooted closer to his chair and leaned her head against the side of his knee. "You brought her peace, I'm sure of it, and it's time for you to let it go." Would that ever be possible? He carried the physical scars of that day with him all of the time. "Do you think I've changed?" Stewart said. "Have I become a better person than the one who taunted Pete, the one who attacked his stepmother?" "Take it from me," Leah said. "I've known you most of your life, and you have changed. You're not that cocky boy anymore. Don't keep beating yourself up over the past. We were all dumb kids." Leah stood up and walked down onto the sand, turning back with the wind blowing her hair in all directions. Stewart couldn't help thinking she looked like a sea goddess. "Come join me," she said. "Do you think that's a good idea?" he said. "I think it's the best idea I've ever had." She gave him her most seductive smile. He barked a laugh. "You don't really want that." She threw her arms up. "Stewart, I swear to God, I don't know how to make it any clearer to you that I don't give a fuck about the wheelchair. Get over here and kiss me, damn it." He shrugged. "If you're sure," he said. "Stop trying to decide for me what I want and just get your butt over here." She was probably the only person who didn't question for a moment whether he even could get over to her in the sand. He pushed his body forward with his hands to the edge of his seat. He paused to lift his thin legs forward off the footplate. He leaned over his legs and placed one hand flat on the sand, but it was too soft, and he tumbled out of his wheelchair onto the beach. His body was a tangled mess, his legs twisted under him. He brushed sand out of his hair and laughed. Leah giggled and grabbed his ankles, pulling him down towards her, and straightening his body in the process. Though it was dark out, the air was still warm. Leah climbed up Stewart, straddling him. He looked up at her dark eyes, and wondered at how strange it was that when they were teenagers he had never taken a moment to really just look at her. Then she leaned forward and pressed her lips on his. He reached his arms around her and held her tightly against himself. He smelled deeply of her salty hair and honey skin. "We're good together," Leah said, "and you know it." "Yes," Stewart said, surrendering. "We are." If you've enjoyed this short story, you can find all of Ruth Madison's work on Amazon and at www.ruthmadisonbooks.com.